You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
On today's episode, we discuss and refute some of the wilder and more egregious claims made by famed Stalinist apologist and truth denialist Grover Furr. Furr's work came to our attention a few episodes back when we talked about the rise of neo-Tankieism on the internet. So for this episode, we invited on a historian of Stalin-era USSR, Leslie Rimmel. She will join us for our main segment today and set the record straight on a few key issues. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanistinitiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. In a few moments, we'll be debunking apologist and denialist claims about Stalin with historian Leslie Rimmel. But first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about some current events. So for our current events section this episode, we're going to be talking about two pieces that were recently published asking how and to what extent the U.S. would need to engage in a process of de-Trumpification, assuming Joe Biden wins the election in November. The first piece is by John Furr, and it's called The De-Trumpification of America. And the second piece is by Paul Rosenberg, and it's called On the De-Trumpification of America. It definitely won't be easy, but it must be done.
John Furr asks the question, let's assume that Donald Trump loses the upcoming election, and let's assume he agrees somehow to leave office. There will still be Trumpism. What happens then? Can this country be de-Trumpified? And if so, how? So Furr points out that the base loves Trump, but they're not true believers in Donald Trump as a person. But the ideology of Trumpism has been there before Trump. It has to do with racial and sexual anxiety, hatred of government and experts, opposition to cosmopolitan internationalism, and it's not so easily rooted out. And if Trump loses and Trump leaves, even assuming that, the Trumpites are going to dig in their heels, just as we saw with the Tea Party after Obama's election. So what Furr does is to look at previous instances of something like de-Trumpification. Reconstruction in the U.S. after the Civil War, denazification in Germany, and de-Baathification after the deposing of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And he says, well, certain things went wrong. What kind of lessons can we draw with respect to whether and how we can de-Trumpify the United States? Looking at Reconstruction, basically, Furr says Reconstruction didn't work because it was defeated by a counter-revolution having to do with the Democratic Party at the time. And the lesson to be drawn is that, quote, today's Republicans, the equivalent of the Northern Democrats of the post-Civil War era, cannot be allowed to persist in their current incarnation as a vehicle for Trumpism. Today's Democrats and chastened Republicans would have to work to make that party, the Republicans, a far less extreme force in American politics, abandoning Trump and reclaiming Lincoln. And he says this is the exact opposite of the approach that Obama tried. Obama said, let's look forward instead of looking backward. Let's not prosecute George W. Bush. And what we saw was the Tea Party, and it does complete intransigence. So it says, look, Obama was just wrong here. With regard to the de-Baathification in Iraq, Furr says, well, we're not as far down the road of pathology in the U.S. as they were in Iraq, because Saddam Hussein had totally institutionalized his rule over a very long period. We don't have that. Most of the U.S. government is not fully Trumpite in an irredeemable way. And then he says, except for the courts, except for the judiciary, we've got a lot of federal judges, we've got the Supreme Court, and so forth. And he doesn't have much in the way to recommend, but he notes a proposal of Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island that would make it illegal for judges to be members of the Federalist Society, which is the group that's behind most of the recommendations, so-called, to Trump. Point this person, okay, that person. Trump's Supreme Court picks are approved by the Federalist Society, and so forth. And then Pfeffer looks at denazification, the Nuremberg trials after World War II, and says, look, wouldn't it be great if the Democrats were just to hand over Trump to the International Criminal Court and allow them to prosecute him for international crimes? But that ain't going to happen. So he says it's going to be up to the American courts to charge and convict Trump. And that can be done under the RICO Act, taking Trump and his top associates and prosecuting them as basically racketeers, mobsters. Taking the Trump organization and prosecuting it as a criminal enterprise. And he says putting Trump on trial could effectively delegitimize Trumpism and prevent a second round of it from occurring. I mean, just show the toxicity and the unacceptability of it. But finally, Pfeffer says it's imperative to separate the legitimate grievances of Trump supporters from the illegitimate ones. And, you know, yeah, they're racist and misogynist and xenophobic, but there's good people on both sides, and they got some legitimate grievances. So what we need is something that also addresses the legitimate grievances of the Trumpite base. And then we get a response to this from Paul Rosenberg, and I do have trouble really understanding what Rosenberg's argument is, and to the extent that I understand it, I got a lot of questions about it. But a lot of it is based on interviews that he did with experts. One, Ian Hughes, who's the author of Disordered Minds, How Dangerous Personalities Are Destroying Democracy, and another psychological take by therapist Elizabeth Mika, maybe it's pronounced Micah, who contributed a chapter to the very important book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, arguing that this is a severe case of psychopathology. So, with regard to Hughes, and Rosenberg relies the most on Hughes says, if you look at the historical record of these cases that Pfeffer has pointed out and so forth, Hughes says nations seldom learn from their descent into pathocracy. And he argues that because of that, a more limited, targeted approach is better than one that tries to change everything at once. Pfeffer is saying, you know, let's do a clean sweep. Hughes is warning this doesn't work for some reason, and a more limited, targeted approach is preferable. And that seems to be what Rosenberg himself is advocating as well. And one key moment of this article by Rosenberg is to note what took place in the denazification in Germany. And he says correctly that the idea that Nazi crimes were the work of a handful of evil leaders was widespread for decades, just a few bad apples. And this only ended, quote, thanks largely to one man, the German Jewish lawyer and Social Democrat Fritz Bauer. And he prosecuted low-level participants in Nazi atrocities, people who'd been active at the low levels in Auschwitz, in the police, low-level judges who had sentenced resistance leaders and Jews, doctors participating in euthanasia, rank-and-file surgeons. And Rosenberg says, without Bauer's tireless efforts, Germany would probably never have faced up to its past. As it was, that took decades to accomplish. And he then quotes Hughes, saying that what's the lesson to be drawn from this? Few countries have attempted to, and no countries have succeeded in the immediate depathologizing of society following a period of tyranny. And it was misguided to try that. An aggressive attempt at de-Trumpification, trying to drive a stake through the heart of Trumpism, is not a desirable course. And he says, this doesn't mean doing nothing, Hughes says, but keep in mind, the vast majority of Trump supporters are not violent. They will accept that Trump is defeated, even as they organize and campaign for the election of someone who will pursue similar policies and similar means in 2024. And the only real pushback to this that I see in the whole article is a passage where Rosenberg quotes Elizabeth Micah, the other psychologist, and she addresses this issue of reconciliation. You get this all the time. You had it in the South Africa Peace and Reconciliation Commission and so forth. What about a program of trying to reconcile the country to overcome the polarization? And she says, Trumpism is an amalgam of grievances that, although fortified by racism, go far beyond it. It is not as much a problem to solve or a rift to heal as a fundamental clash of values. There is is no reconciliation to be had between the psychopathic lack of conscience and our recognition, respect for, and desire to live according to higher values. Choosing higher values, however, is the right path. But then Rosenberg takes us back to Hughes, who says, pathocracies live on chaos and division. To destroy a pathocracy, tensions must be reduced, hatreds ameliorated, and reason and care must again become the foundations of society, which sounds to me like, choose reconciliation.
Well, I think these pieces are very interesting. They give one a lot to think about. I wonder if this posing of the question as like this choice as to how extreme and aggressive de-Trumpification should proceed, I wonder if some of that question will, like the answer will be forced upon Joe Biden if he's somehow able to win. And that would be because it's very unlikely that Trump is going to go quietly, and there will probably be a power struggle that happens in November, and it might involve different factions within the U.S. government and civil society, obviously, as well. And if Joe Biden is able to come out on top of that power struggle, his hand might be forced to take an aggressive stance against Trump's allies in the government. He sort of has this image of the smiling, friendly senator who's willing to reach across the aisle and make friends with Republicans like the good old days. But the reality might just force him into a very different position. And, one thing that can be said from Joe Biden is he knows how to be a chameleon and shapeshift with the times.
Yeah, if it comes to that, I think he's lost. But yeah, you're right. I mean, his official line is reach across the aisle. We can work with them to a limited extent. I think recent events have shown him that that's really a thing of the past. He might keep saying that, but that's just an election slogan. I think it's increasingly clear, and we're getting, fairly mainstream people now seriously talking about the problem not being just Trump and it not being the economic anxiety of the so-called white working class, but Trumpism. And the fact that we're getting that recognition, understanding that this is a deep, long-standing problem and that Trumpism needs to be rooted out, I mean, that's all to the good. And I think that that's going to penetrate Biden campaign, a Biden administration, if we have it. But still in all, we're getting this split between, let's go slow versus let's root these people out once and for all and drive a stake through the heart of Trumpism, which gives a new meaning to the idea of Trump stakes. I mean, frankly, I don't understand the go slow argument at all. Basically, we have the notion that, okay, if you look at 3 data points, because that's what we've got here, it's anecdotes, right? There's not a lot of historical examples, but if you look at de-Baathification, you look at Reconstruction, you look at denazification, they all had problems, they all didn't succeed or totally failed and so forth. But why? Well, in the case of Reconstruction, it was because of an opposition to Reconstruction that was allowed to become the dominant power. I mean, white supremacism. So what lesson do you draw from that? That we should go slow, or that you have to be more aggressive and don't engage in any compromise with these people until this is totally rooted out? I think it's obvious that it's the latter. Or if you take the thing that the guy he was quoting, Hughes, talks about, okay, denazification. Well, the Allies wanted West Germany to be a good partner to fight the Cold War, and so they allowed a lot of Nazis to be crawling all throughout the West German society and government and so forth. That's what kept Nazism, kept it going for a very, very long time. It seems to me obvious you need a more forceful, aggressive, thorough cleansing of the society and the government and so forth. And what Hughes points to is, well, it took this Jewish lawyer in Germany, long time to prosecute low-level Nazis and to get, therefore, consciousness that this was not just a few bad apples at the top. Right, it took a long time. We can't be assured of immediate success within 6 months, a year, but that doesn't mean that to get that success, you go slow and have a relaxed attitude or a compromising attitude. It means that even if you have a forceful, aggressive campaign, it is not assured of success, in particular immediate success.
Yeah, I agree. These people are a total threat to liberal democracy and to the safety of other people, and they need to be rooted out and stopped at all points. I mean, just last night, this crazy QAnon conspiracy woman, Marjorie Taylor Greene, won her Republican primary in Georgia and looks headed to be a Republican congresswoman from Georgia this year. She's a QAnon believer, which QAnon has been labeled a domestic terrorist ideology by the FBI, but it has now followers in the U.S. Congress, and I don't know what they're planning to do. They're going to scour the halls of Congress trying to find what they believe are satanic pedophile chambers hidden somewhere in the basement or something. But you can't reach across the aisle to these people. They don't think rationally, and they're very dangerous.
Yeah, and in terms of the consciousness issue, I really did appreciate in the Rosenberg article that he did quote Elizabeth Micah, I don't know her name, and saying this is a clash of values, psychopathological values versus decent human values, and there is no reconciliation here. It's not that these people misunderstand or are just acting out on legitimate grievances. They're fundamentally for different things, and what they are for is an immediate and fatal threat to us. Okay, and we've seen that. I mean, and we're talking about putting people in cages. We're talking about the police murders. We're talking about what they did to Puerto Rico, and now we're talking about maybe 200,000 people in the U.S. who are dying because of this nonsense. So it's an immediate threat to us, and to say don't respond to this threat as if it's a threat, but a political disagreement, so let them continue to try to vie for power and come back in 2024. How long can society continue with these people threatening us and putting us in dire fear at every moment? We're absolutely frightened all the time. This is not living. So, I mean, yeah, I think the power of the Republican Party needs to be smashed. I think it's really legitimate to think about declaring the Republican Party to be a domestic terrorist organization and treating it accordingly. And, you allow differences of political opinion, but here we're not talking about differences of political opinion. We're talking about immediate harm. And so I think that we really have to consider what these people have done and what they're capable of and willing to do, and to understand that self-defense is really important. This is not a political discussion. This is a matter of self-defense. I mean, even if you don't say declare the Republican Party a terrorist organization, even if you just say put maximal pressure to try to make sure that the Trumpites are defanged and maybe never Trumpers get control of the Republican Party and so forth, even if you say something, kind of wishy-washy like that, at least that's saying you got to dismantle any hope that these people have of getting political power from now on. That seems to me to be the minimal goal, and I'm not understanding how anybody cannot see that. It seems to me so obvious.
Well, that was a somewhat longer than usual current event section, and up now our main segment, an interview with Leslie Rimmel.
We're very pleased to have on the podcast today Leslie Rimmel. She's a professor at Oklahoma State University in the Department of History, where she specializes in Russian, Central Asian, and modern European history. And she will be discussing with us the Stalin period in the USSR, and in particular what she thinks about what Grover Furr has to say about that. Leslie, you got your PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, Penn, and you wrote your dissertation on a topic that's very closely related to something we'll be talking about in connection with Grover Furr, who basically denies that Stalin played a role in the mass repressions in the 1930s in the USSR. What was your dissertation about?
Well, it was actually about ordinary people at that time, or, people in the city of Leningrad, as it was called then. It's back to its name of St. Petersburg. And I wanted to see or take a measure of how people were reacting to different policies that were coming down. down. And did they support them? Did they not support them? How could you even tell? Because there certainly weren't just, the usual kind of surveys that you could do. And so you had to kind of really triangulate to find out what people were thinking. But I was very fortunate to be doing my research at a time when the archives were very open. It was just wonderful. That helped quite a bit because we would get reports on what people were saying. And then, of course, you still had to decide, well, is this made up or did they really say this? And you had to use, a lot of judgment to see what seemed to be a reliable statement. And there were, people who were listening in all the time. So some of the statements maybe weren't that trustworthy.
Well, Leslie, thank you for being on the podcast today. The reason we wanted to have you on the podcast today was because we've done several episodes now on this phenomena of the rise of neo-Tankieism today, sort of these self-radicalized youth who, in their search for alternatives to the status quo, have found themselves in the company of radical apologists for Stalin. We interviewed two young people a few months ago who talked about their journey through all sorts of vulgar Stalinist apologetics before they sort of thought their way out of it and found the real Marx. But this was a surprise to us, Andrew and Ann and I. We didn't realize this phenomenon was out there. We don't hang around all these corners of the internet where people are sort of self-radicalizing like that and reading crazy Stalinist apologists like Grover Furr and filling their heads with all sorts of lies, basically. And that leads us to Grover Furr, who, after years of existing on the fringes of the lunatic left as a Stalinist apologist, has now found himself a minor celebrity in this strange echo chamber of young Stalinist leftists on the internet. And this was all new to us, so we had to do some of our own research. This is probably where I should say a thank you to Van Sewall, who did a lot of research for us and about sort of the more extravagant claims Grover Furr has said. So that's why we asked you here today, Leslie. The conversation does require a little more setup than our normal interviews. We need to sort of lay out for our audience who Grover Furr is. So, Andrew, who is Grover Furr?
He's a professor of medieval English at Montclair State University in New Jersey, and he's very closely associated with a group called the Progressive Labor Party, which is sort of an unreconstructed Maoist organization. He's written many books. Just to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that he's interested in, it's essentially to tell us Stalin was, just a peachy keen guy. One book is called Khrushchev Lied, in, his secret speech denouncing Stalin. Esov versus Stalin, The Truth About Mass Repressions and the So-Called Great Terror in the USSR. The Fraud of the Dewey Commission, and The Mystery of the Katyn Massacre, The Evidence, the Solution. Furr has dismissed, quote, Soviet studies in the West, close quote, as simply, quote, propaganda with footnotes. From out of our research, we selected issues that are prominent in Furr's work.
So one of the things that Grover Furr claims is that Stalin was not responsible for the mass repression in the late 30s in the Soviet Union. Furr alleges that in his famous 1956 secret speech, Khrushchev made 61 accusations against Stalin. Furr claims that he investigated all 61 accusations and that in his book, Khrushchev Lied, he was able to prove that 60 of them are demonstrably false. He says that he could not confirm or disconfirm the remaining one. The fifth of these so-called lies was Khrushchev's allegation that beginning in the second half of the 1930s, the practice of mass repression through the government apparatus was born. Mass repression was at first unleashed against what Khrushchev called enemies of Leninism, Trotskyists, Zinovievites, Bukharinites, but later, Khrushchev says, it was also unleashed against what Khrushchev called many honest communists. Although Furr characterizes this whole statement as a lie, he does not deny that Nikolai Yuzhov, head of the secret police, the NKVD, from 1936 to late 38 was responsible for mass repression. Instead, what troubles Furr is Khrushchev's claim, also from the secret speech, that Yuzhov was acting on behalf of Stalin, not leading some rogue operation. Khrushchev stated that without Stalin's orders and his sanctions, Yuzhov could not have done this. In response to this allegation, Furr argues that Yuzhov's actions were indeed a rogue operation and in fact part of a more, quote, widespread rightist Trotskyist series of anti-government conspiracies. And he writes, quote, all the evidence we presently have points to the existence of a widespread rightist Trotskyite series of anti-government conspiracies involving many leading party leaders, both NKVD chiefs Yagoda and Yuzhov, high-ranking military leaders, and many others. Broadly speaking, this is more or less the picture drawn by the Stalin government at the time. There is a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that Khrushchev himself may well have been a participant in this right Trotskyite conspiracy. End quote. The evidence that Furr refers to here consists principally of confessions made by Yuzhov and Mikhail Furnovsky, Yuzhov's second in command, that were first published in 2006. Furr also relies on testimony that Stalin gave, which he claims is, quote, entirely consistent with the evidence presented by Mark Jansen and Nikita Petrov in their 2002 biography of Yuzhov. Jansen and Petrov's understanding of the matter is, however, extremely different. Their biography is called Stalin's Loyal Executioner, People's Commander Nikolai Yuzhov. Once again, Furr does not mention, much less address, evidence that might support Khrushchev's allegations, nor does he engage with alternative interpretations of the evidence that he does present. However, later in the book, Furr does have a long methodological discussion in which he discusses, inter alia, why he does not necessarily dismiss evidence from confessions that were or may have been coerced through torture, and why he does not regard what Khrushchev said in the secret speech as valid evidence. The short version of this argument is that a tortured person may be telling the truth, and that Khrushchev was rarely truthful. Maybe we should start off with a little context so that people who don't know their Russian history might have a little context. Leslie, what exactly specifically took place during the mass repression campaign of the late 30s?
Basically, people were accused of being enemies of the people, and they were often just taken in the middle of the night. They were often people who had been very loyal to Stalin, and they would then get just taken away. They always came at night, and people who thought they might be liable, like if they were in the party, because it's the party people who got hit the hardest, they would have their clothes all ready to go, and they would be held, taken away, be held in maybe first a prison or a holding place, and eventually maybe sent off into the Far East, where it was cold, and they were put to work, and that was part of what became known as the Gulag, the system of labor camps. And there was generally no rhyme or reason for this, and it was partly there were quotas. There were quotas that we have the evidence for each area, sort of provincial area. There were numbers that had to be met, and so if you were in the particular office that was in charge of this, you had to be the one to pick people who were going to be taken. And some of them were shot outright. There were two sets of conditions. You could either be immediately shot, or you were sent to the Gulag, to the camp.
Mass repression, about how many people are we referring to?
The number that I think has become the most used one is 800,000. I think that's about right. I mean, it's about what you see in most of the textbooks. And, they were taken, they were shoved into trains, kind of very much like the Holocaust. Some of them, of course, didn't survive. And of course, there had already been operations like this. I mean, the first, and I guess one of the worst ones was what they called the Kulak operation. And that was for so-called rich peasants, which were a figment of the regime's imagination. This is in the early 30s, and they were taken, mostly men, were picked up, shoved into the trains, and dumped off somewhere, in the middle of nowhere. So that's all part of it. It's best to look at it as different waves of repressions.
And am I right that there are different terms people use for the mass repressions of the late 30s? It might be called the Great Terror or the Great Purge?
Yeah. And they, it developed as, writers started to get more access to archives and things.
And now in 2020, is there a general consensus amongst historians about what happened during the mass repressions of the 30s?
I think so. I mean, there was a time when there were really, really heavily disputed arguments, at the conferences, the scholarly conferences, and you don't hear that anymore. So I think there is kind of a consensus that has been gelling in recent years.
And what accounts for that consensus? I mean, is it new evidence?
Yeah, I think so. The archival evidence.
So Grover Furr doesn't deny that any of these things happened during the mass repressions, but he claims that Stalin was not responsible for any of them, that they were the result of some kind of rightist, Trotskyist conspiracy. Do you think there's any evidence for that kind of claim?
No, and I think that it's sort of like what people are talking about now when, some of these people who are writing about martial law and everything and Trumpism, and they anticipate, what to do. And, Stalin doesn't have to like crack a whip and say, do it. They anticipate if they want to stay on the right, or what they consider to be the safe side of things.
You mean somebody like William Barr does not have to have a conversation in which Trump orders him? William Barr knows what he needs to do to please Trump.
Exactly.
So people knew what they needed to do to please Stalin, and they knew that they wanted to stay on that side rather than the other side because of what would happen to them, and so they did what they knew they needed to do.
Yeah, so the living side rather than the dead side, although it never guaranteed you anything, no matter what you did. But at least you would try if you were, trying to be on what they considered to be the safe side.
Right, so that the fact that we don't have, perhaps, evidence of Stalin issuing a directive, there's no, written directive that has been uncovered to that effect.
Just that list that I mentioned. No, there is actually another one. The most famous one, and that evidence came out when I was also working in the archives. The directive has a number, with a number of zeros and sevens and things.
We had to pause the podcast here to look up the number. It's NKVD order number 00447. It's very easy to find on the internet. You can just Google 00447 and mass repression, and you'll find it.
That was the one specifically that had the quotas, but it was in the name of the Politburo.
Oh, wow. And who was the head of the Politburo?
Well, it was de facto Stalin.
Yeah.
But actually, Molotov was, always had these high positions, but he was a lackey.
So there's lists of people to be picked up, and this list is coming down from the Politburo in a document. The list itself indicates that it is a directive of the Politburo.
Yeah.
Wherein the de facto head of that Politburo is Stalin. To me, that is decisive evidence. There's nothing more to say.
Well, I need to go look. I have I looked at some of those documents, and I should have, if I had more time, I would have looked at some of the books that I've read. But there were different, there were a number of these kinds of lists, but there were the one that was kind of the most sickening, to me, was the one that had just how many for this region and how many for that region. And so the people of those regions, there would be three political officers in charge of these things. And so it was a troika, threesome, and they had to make the decisions. So not a job that people would necessarily want.
I mean, do you take these confessions in which these guys basically...
Oh, no, the confessions were coerced, of course.
Right. The confessions are coerced. And what about Furr's statement? Well, a coerced confession could still be true. What do you think about that?
Well, the torture was, most of these things were coerced through torture. Sleep deprivation especially, and that'll give what they want.
So you're saying that if somebody's tortured, it's likely that they will say things that the torturers want to hear to stop the torture, and so that is itself evidence that it's untrue. It might not be 100% dispositive, but it is relevant evidence that we should be skeptical of the truth value of what's contained in the confession.
Yeah, and sometimes people confess to save a relative. Like they would, if I confess this, will you protect my son or something?
So just to be clear here, this isn't just a case of saying, well, Stalin must have known this happened because she was in charge of the government when all this stuff was happening, or not just a case of saying, well, people did this to please Stalin because they intuited that he wanted this to happen, but there's actual documentary evidence that Stalin ordered these purges and that he knew about this order 00447, right?
They did sign it. They checked their names off. They would go, pass this paper around.
Oh, wow. It doesn't only say Politburo and here's the list of who to pick up, but each individual on the Politburo checked their name off.
Yeah.
So they're all individually culpable.
Yeah.
Wow. We're going to post a link to this document in the podcast description, as well as information about other secret cables between Stalin and Yuzhov about the planning for the mass repressions of the 30s. Leslie, the mass repressions targeted not just political enemies, but also a lot of ethnic groups as well, right?
It was called the Kulak Operation. That was one of its nicknames. But they also pretty much got almost every priest that was still alive and others. I mean, they had different subgroups. I mean, they had within that, it was the Polish operation because there were, a lot of Poles who had left Poland. There was a German operation and a whole slew of other nationality operations. So, yeah, there was a whole lot in that. It was very complex.
Well, let's move on. We did research some of the other crazy things that Grover Furr claims.
And one of them is what Furr characterizes as Stalin's struggle for democratic reform. In 2005, he published a two-part article in Cultural Logic, a Maoist theoretical journal, about this, and he outlined what he called Stalin's attempts from the 1930s until his death to democratize the government of the Soviet Union, and he asserted that the facts discussed in his article, quote, helped to disprove the interpretation of Stalin as a power-hungry dictator, betrayer of Lenin's legacy. Furr argues that Stalin wanted to get the Communist Party out of the job of running the country, have that turn over to the Soviets, and Furr says, quote, that Stalin, quote, raised the fight against bureaucratism with great vigor as early as his report to the 17th Party Congress in January 1934, and that Stalin seems to have achieved his aim with the 1936 Soviet Constitution, which called for contested elections and universal secret elections. But Furr says there was a lot of resistance to this within the party leadership, and so the contested elections that Stalin was in favor of were canceled and never held. And he goes through additional attempts, allegedly, by Stalin to continue his effort to democratize the Soviet Union. Stalin approved a draft of a document, a draft to the Central Committee, wherein the party would be legally distanced from power. That was in 1944. And he goes through a number of facts which basically indicate that Stalin was trying to split the party from the Politburo, from the government. So he wanted the party he wanted the party to do party things and the government to do government things. And so, for instance, in 1952, Stalin called for the replacement of the Politburo, which had both party and government members, and he wanted a presidium wherein there were no reserved seats for top government officials in a party, presidium. Stalin at that time resigned from the post of General Secretary of the party, and he proposed that he would resign from the Central Committee altogether, remaining only as head head of state. So he was like saying, I'll do government things, not party things. And there's a little bit more in the article, but not much. And the article basically has nothing to say about any other evidence related to the issue of democratic reform, and it does not engage with any alternative interpretations of the evidence that it does present, the large bulk of which I've just summarized here.
Yeah, well, it's just, to me, democratic reform can mean so many different things. It can be defined so many ways. And so it's what exactly do they mean? That's what I wonder.
Okay. So, yeah, there are different meanings of the words democratic reform. But would you say that the evidence that he presents is sufficient to justify Furr's conclusion that Stalin persistently attempted to democratize the government of the Soviet Union?
Well, the words were always there. There were various projects that were announced to do that, but it doesn't mean it happened.
Right. And Furr has the interpretation that it didn't happen because Stalin was not a power-hungry dictator, and he didn't have enough power and authority to get his democratic reforms through. They had the new constitution that was going to have secret contested elections, and won the constitution, but then the elections were called off and they didn't take place. Is that a reasonable interpretation of what took place?
I think it was just words to try to impress people, but he had no intention of really doing it.
And why do you say that? I mean, what's the evidence that it was just words?
It didn't happen. These reforms, so-called, didn't happen, and some of the things that were touted as reforms weren't really.
And what about? I mean, I'm pretty sure I know what Grover Furr would say. Well, this is what Stalin wanted, but he wasn't able to make it happen because of resistance within opponents or people with different views in the leadership.
No, I'm not. You'd have to really dig deep to find some kind of evidence for that, I think. Individuals rebelling against it. So there's just when you get to that, there's so much hearsay.
For Furr to arrive at that kind of conclusion, is it also a matter of just ignoring other evidence and context?
Yeah, I assume so.
You earlier talked about people being regularly spied on and having the substance of their discussions transcribed and reported to authorities. To me, that just says this is not a democratic country. You're not free to speak. So, I mean, what was Stalin's attitude to that? Is that relevant evidence to whether he wanted to turn the USSR into a democracy?
Yeah, well, he could call it a reform, and even though we wouldn't consider it to be a reform. So, like I say, it's sometimes it's just words. If you get that, my meaning there.
I'm not sure. I mean, words means that they had no intention of doing it, but you could have an intention of holding contested elections in a situation where, the opposition cannot function freely, and you're going to rig the election, and so you got a contested election, and that could be called democratization, but it's not any kind of democratization that I would care about.
Right.
Looking at the larger context of what Stalin was doing at the time in the mid 1930s, would you say that he was on a project to institute real, genuine democracy with, individual liberty and real debate and oppositions that were able to contest for power, or was he not about that at all?
No, I'd say the latter.
Well, let me ask it this way. He puts forward certain facts. He concludes that this is sufficient evidence. You say it's not sufficient evidence because it could be just words. Okay, good. Do you have any evidence from other things that were happening at the time, before or after, to suggest that it was just words?
Well, let's see, this might be a little earlier. No, this would be the 30s. There was a big discussion about abortion. And so people were invited to send in their opinions. Should it remain legal or should it be outlawed? And apparently a lot more people wanted it to remain legal, and that's not what happened. So I think that might be one example.
So the idea there was basically something sort of like a referendum process, or at least a promise that the authorities would do what the people wanted, and then they didn't.
Right.
I mean, genuine democratic reform, one would think, would involve a sort of society where critics were free to voice dissent. It had, free to form alternative power blocks in society, were free from persecution for their dissent. Was there any space for that in, in Stalin's Russia? Or, what happened to people who tried to make space for that? Could anyone actually legitimately contest an election or contest decisions made by Stalin?
There really wasn't anyone who was going to contest it, except in some of those early cases in the 20s and 30s, where the ones who were like Rutin, a really fine guy who wrote this big manifesto against Stalin. And of course, you can imagine what happened to him.
What happened to him?
Oh, he and his whole family were murdered.
For speaking out against Stalin?
Yeah, and it was pretty direct, very explicit, like we have to get rid of Stalin sort of writing.
Right. And so they got rid of him for that reason.
Yeah. And then, it was when the purges started to really pile up, the rest of the family.
So they liquidated him and his family.
Yeah. Not all at the same time.
No. So is that something that you would regard as relevant to the question of whether Stalin was trying to democratize the USSR? Why doesn't Furr bring in something like that into this discussion?
Yeah, well, it just was inconvenient, I suppose.
In just a few moments, we'll return to our interview with Leslie Rimmel. First, a few words from Anne Jacquard of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors our podcast.
Hello, this is Anne Jacquard, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Donayevskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses, whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Today's political, economic, and environmental crises present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. We intend to practice, as well as espouse, a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice.
Leslie, as we all know, there's been a real upswing in the amount of denialism in our culture, everything from denialism of the Holocaust to denialism of the reality around 9/11 to denial of climate change, to the sort of the daily assault on reality that is Trumpism. Would you put Grover Furr's work into that same category of denialism?
Well, as far as I can tell, I mean, I haven't read as much as you probably have his work. What I have read, I didn't find all that helpful, but yeah, I think there's definitely denialism there from what I've read.
Well, Leslie, I mean, you may have encountered various species of denialism, connected with Russia, connected with whatever in your career as a historian. I always just wonder, and like your view, why do you think there is this urge to deny unpleasant realities on the part of many people? Is that just like a constant of human nature? Or is there some aspect of current society that's exacerbating this problem?
Well, I think it could be both. I mean, I guess that's a cop-out. But, I mean, I don't think the majority of people are deniers, which is, a good thing. I think that we are more and more trying to ensure in education that people see what is what, so there are all kinds of Holocaust seminars and everything. And Holocaust education is widely happening in schools and et cetera. But yeah, I think it's just it's kind of lazy thinking, denialism. And also, though, there is this aspect that these things happen that do seem incredible, incredible, not believable. And so it makes it a little bit easier for people who tend not to believe in that things could go badly, but they do. And we're finding that out here, that it's not always smooth sailing. Look, we've got the pandemic and everything around it. So I think there are psychological and educational issues.
Right, and you mentioned the Holocaust, and Holocaust denial is a huge, issue. And 20 years ago, Deborah Lipstadt, a historian at Emory University, successfully defended herself against a libel charge by this guy Irving, a Holocaust denier. And recently, she entered into this discussion about what we can do about denialism. And people have various views because a lot of people say, fact-checking doesn't work. And she acknowledges that, putting forward the, quote, historical facts, that's not enough alone to counter denial. But she says the facts are our most important weapon. And I kind of take it that when you were referring to the organizing of seminars and stuff, that you would agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And to, where possible, to bring people to see the sites of where these things happened. And no, it's definitely very important. And in fact, I was invited to be in one of her seminars, and I wasn't able to accept just because of my retirement.
Looking at when you Google Grover Furr, you see he's written like 12 books. They're all like the same kind of thing. Trotsky lied, Khrushchev lied, everybody lied. I'm gonna guess that a lot of these like internet Stalinists, who are like probably like between the ages of like 16 and 24, don't even read his books. But the fact that there's a person who has written them lets them justify their positions, and they probably like have read some glosses of his books, so they're probably not very sophisticated thinkers in the first place.
But 16-year-old Stalinists, I mean, what is a 16-year-old doing thinking about Stalin? I mean, they should have other things on their mind.
Well, that's right. That's what I thought until we did this interview with these two kids back in the spring, and they were saying like one of the most influential like Stalinist blogger YouTube video persons was like a teenager. I had no idea this was a thing, but
the internet brings us all kinds of strange things. But so young. I mean, it's sort of strange.
Yeah, I mean, so given that certain people seem to be immune to facts, other people are scratching their heads trying to think through what else can possibly be done to combat denialism. I mean, there's a lot of suggestions out there. For instance, Robert P. Crease, who's a philosopher and historian of science, he suggested that one way to fight science denial is to expose it through comedy and ridicule. Do you think that this or anything else might be effective in combating Stalinist denialism?
Well, like I say, reading some of these books some of which are very beautifully written, might help, if they will read, because that's always a question. And it's tough. You got to keep trying. You got to open their eyes.
Yeah, so we were referring to Deborah Lipstadt, and she says, okay, like the most important thing is to produce the facts and to try to get people acquainted with the facts. But she also says there is another weapon in our arsenal, to combat denial. And she says that that's quick and forceful condemnation by scholars, political and religious leaders, and other people of stature of denial and deniers. And what I found most interesting is that she said there must be condemnation of both hardcore and softcore denial. And obviously what she means by hardcore denial in like the present context is somebody like Grover Furr. But what she means by softcore denial isn't coming right out and saying, no, Stalin didn't do any of that. Roughly speaking, it's whataboutism, it's deflection. If we're talking about evidence of Stalinism's crimes against humanity, you deflect by reciting despicable actions of Western capitalist countries or otherwise try to change the subject. And when I think about it, for every hardcore denier like Grover Furr, there are dozens of softcore deniers like Rick Wolff. He's a popular pro-Stalinist economics professor. And they don't say, no, Stalin didn't do these things. They engage in whataboutism, they engage in deflection. So do you think that quick and forceful condemnation might do some good, like not only against Holocaust denial, but against this, Tankie resurgence of Stalinism was just peachy keen stuff?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because, if you just get on to it, and so that they don't have other competing options in their heads, get it sooner, and then, maybe when they see the opposite, they will think, oh, okay, that's not right.
So you can't combat something with nothing. So you got to be out there with something. That's brilliant. No, that's brilliant. No, that's brilliant. I love it.
All right. Yeah, well, it's to me though, it's still kind of odd that there are young Stalinists.
Yeah, and we're getting a lot of people who say, "Oh, don't worry about them. Youth do crazy things. They hotwire cars, and they got weird hairstyles, and these people are not big enough to be an immediate threat to us." And I'm like, all cancers start small.
Yeah,
there's a lot of toleration of this. And we've even gotten, on our own website pushing back against, our condemnation of like that panel that I was on. By people who would never say that they're Stalinists, but there's just like this toleration of it.
Yeah. Well, just keep pushing.
Leslie, thank you for being on Radio Free Humanity today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's my first podcast, and I enjoyed it.
Good. Well, that's all the time we have in the podcast today. You've been listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. As always, if you like the podcast, please do subscribe to the podcast, put it on your RSS feed, share it on social media. We would love to hear from you, so please do write and tell us what you think.